Hi and welcome back. We need to sand all 6 surfaces of the cutting board. The 2 faces, top and bottom, the 2 edges, front and back, and the 2 ends, the left and right side of the cutting board. So there will be 6 all in all. Now we'll say the easiest way to sand a cutting board would be to utilize a power sander. If you happen to have a power sander yourself, you can certainly use that. You may have a friend or a relative that has a power sander, or someone that you can ask to borrow one. I do want to give a couple of words of caution if you are intending on using a power sander to do your sanding. First of all, if you use a belt sander, it is very easy to over sand with a belt sander. Belt sanders are very avid removers of material. And if you leave the belt sander in one place, if you don't have much experience with that, there's a temptation to do that. You can actually sand troughs into your cutting board. And so be very careful if you are using a belt sander. And then with a random orbital sander, if you sand and let's say there's glue left on your board and the sanding pad picks up that glue, that will actually be detrimental because you will create little swirl marks in your cutting board. Or if the sander itself, you just wear the sanding pad out over time, or if it picks up any little grit that's a little too hard, that doesn't get taken away by the air, it's not evacuated, and it gets stuck on the pad, you can actually leave little swirl marks all throughout your cutting board. And when you stain it, or not stain it, but when you oil it, you'll see those little swirl marks. And so what we want on our cutting board, we want to have knife marks because of use. We don't want to have swirl marks from a random orbital sander. So be very careful if you're using power tools to do your sanding. We can utilize just hand sanding to sand all of these surfaces. This by far would be one of the more difficult tasks just because we're trying to take hardwood down to a very smooth surface. I would recommend then, if you are doing it by hand, to go to a construction site nearby. There's bound to be one, a new home perhaps being built in your area, and just pick up a block of 2x4, a small block, maybe 4 to 6 inches long, something that you can take your sandpaper and make a sanding block out of that. And this will save your hands as you sand on your boards. And so let's get started. We'll talk about the techniques as far as sanding is concerned, some things to watch out for, some things to definitely do, and then we'll proceed with sanding our cutting board. Okay, here we are with our cutting board. I've got a block of wood and some 80 grit sandpaper, and we're going to start with, at least in our video, 80 grit sandpaper. You can start with sandpaper that is more abrasive, and that would be a 60 or a 40 grit. But remember, the more abrasive the sandpaper is, the deeper the scratches will be in the wood, and the more sanding you will have to do ultimately. The larger grit sandpaper, or the lower number sandpaper, definitely will take more material away quicker, but the scratches again will be deeper. So I would recommend starting with 80 grit, and it does take a bit of time to get down to a smooth flat surface. And we're looking for smooth and relatively flat for something that's to be sanded by hand like this, that's so small. And it should be relatively flat just from our glue up. One of the other temptations that you will face in sanding, the temptation one would be going with the larger grit or lower number, is to sand across the grain, because you may feel that as you sand across the grain of the wood that you take away the joint material quicker. However, keep in mind that when you're sanding, you are scratching the wood, and especially with these coarser grit sandpapers, your scratches are deeper. And as you sand across the grain, those scratches become very evident in the finish of the wood itself. So it is always the best practice to sand with the grain, because the direction of the grain can help hide some of those scratches as we work out our sanding. Now we will go from 80 grit to 120 grit to 220 grit, and if possible, you may want to go to 320 grit, but probably 220 will be adequate. We're going to use an oil finish on this that was provided in the kit, and with that oil finish, that 220 grit would be quite adequate for sanding. So therefore, you're only going to sand with 3 different sandpapers. The first time you sand with this 80 grit, then you need to take the board down till it is smooth, till you can rub your hand across it and not feel the joints per se, not feel lips on the joints. And so once you get that taken care of with the 80 grit, the 120 and the 220 grit sanding will be relatively easy, and all you will be doing at that point is removing scratches from the coarser grit paper as you work your way down. So we want to sand with the grain, and then as far as rounding any edges or corners, you know, our cutting board, we have 90-degree corners or edges that are can be harsh. So you may want to round those over. I typically will do that again with all 3 grits. So I start with my 80 grit to take those corners away. At the ends of your cutting board, the same rule applies. We want to sand with the grain. So I'm not going to sand across my corner like this. I'm going to sand down the corner at a 45-degree angle like this. And the same on my corners, the same on my edges. I want to sand with the grain at all times so that those scratches don't show up and cause problems in my finish. I'm going to get one surface done, and then I'm going to turn the board over and get the other surface done. Now the last thing I want to mention is, if you're sanding on a surface, you want some way for this board to be held or maintained. You don't want it to be sliding back and forth, especially on a piece of furniture if you're doing this at your dining room table. So again, a hand towel would work in this instance. We can put the hand towel down, we can put our cutting board on top of that hand towel, and then we can commence with our sanding. And the hand towel will separate the cutting board from our furniture, from our table. So let's get started. We'll need to somehow attach this sandpaper to our block, and I'm just going to hold it in place right now, and we're going to start sanding. I'm going to move. I'm not going to stay in one place. I'm going to move from side to side as I sand back and forth, and I'm going to go through kind of an S pattern as I work my way across this board. I don't want to stay in one place and cause a dip or a sag. This is going to take a bit of time, and so just proceed with patience, and eventually you will get there. One quick word about sanding. Whenever you're sanding with wood, you're creating sawdust and fine dust particles, and those particles can cause problems with your sinuses, and that's why we've included a dust mask in your woodworking kit. So definitely go ahead and wear that. Some of these dust masks, you may feel a little bit uncomfortable at first, but I assure you, especially when you're sanding with some particular woods like cedars or some of the exotic hardwoods, that the dust mask will save you a lot of trouble with your sinuses. Dust can really irritate your sinuses, and it can also cause further problems and damage if you have prolonged exposure to that. So as we continue sanding, I'm going to put my dust mask on, and I encourage you to do the same.